History has seen wars that destroyed empires, wars that burned cities, wars that changed religions, borders, languages, and entire civilizations. And then there is the Kettle War, a war where the only real casualty was cookware. One cannon shot, one soup kettle, no great battlefield, no heroic last stand, no mountain of bodies, just a Dutch ship, an Austrian ship, a disputed river, and a cooking pot that happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But do not let the ridiculous name fool you. The Kettle War was not really about soup. It was about trade. It was about empire. It was about the great port of Antwerp being strangled for nearly 2 centuries. It was about the Dutch Republic protecting its commercial power. And it was about Emperor Joseph II trying to force open one of Europe's most contested waterways. This is the Kettle War of 1784, the war that began with a grand imperial challenge and became famous because someone shot a kettle. To understand why a soup kettle became a diplomatic incident, we need to start with a river, the Scheldt. The Scheldt rises in northern France, runs through what is now Belgium, passes Antwerp, and reaches the North Sea through Dutch territory. That last part mattered enormously, because Antwerp was one of Europe's great commercial cities. In the 1500s, Antwerp was rich, busy, connected, and powerful. Goods flowed through its port. Merchants came from across Europe. Money moved. Ideas moved. Ships moved. Then came the Dutch Revolt. The northern Netherlands rebelled against Spanish Habsburg rule. The southern Netherlands, including Antwerp, remained under Habsburg control. And after Antwerp fell to the Spanish in 1585, the Dutch gained control over the lower Scheldt. They closed the river to sea trade. That meant ships could not freely sail from the North Sea up the Scheldt to Antwerp. And that changed everything. Antwerp declined. Amsterdam rose. One city's silence became another city's golden age. For the Dutch Republic, closing the Scheldt was not just a military measure. It was economic strategy. Why allow Antwerp to recover as a rival port when Amsterdam and other Dutch ports were thriving? Why reopen the river and strengthen the southern Netherlands? So the Scheldt stayed closed, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. By the 1780s, the situation was almost absurd. The river was there. The port was there. The ships were there. But politics had turned geography into a locked door. Now enter Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, Habsburg ruler, son of Maria Theresa, restless reformer, and not a man who enjoyed being told no. Joseph II ruled the Austrian Netherlands, roughly modern Belgium and Luxembourg. He looked at Antwerp and saw a city that could be revived. He looked at the Scheldt and saw a commercial artery deliberately blocked. He looked at the Dutch Republic and saw a weakened neighbor. And he saw opportunity. The Dutch Republic in the early 1780s was not the powerhouse it had once been. It had been hurt by the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Its politics were bitterly divided between Orangists and Patriots. Its navy was not what it had been in the age of the great admirals. Joseph thought the moment had come. He demanded changes. He wanted Dutch troops out of barrier fortresses. He wanted territorial concessions. And most importantly, he wanted the Scheldt reopened. To Joseph, this was justice. Why should the Dutch control the commercial life of Antwerp? Why should the Austrian Netherlands remain economically trapped? Why should a river be closed because of a settlement from another age? To the Dutch, the answer was simple. Because it protected their power. Because treaties said so. Because reopening Antwerp could damage Dutch trade. Because once a great commercial rival is dead, wise republics do not help resurrect it. Diplomacy dragged on. Arguments turned into demands. Demands turned into threats. Then Joseph II decided to force the issue. In October 1784, he sent ships from Antwerp down the Scheldt. This was not a massive invasion fleet. It was symbolic, a test, a dare, an imperial message floating downriver. Among the vessels was the imperial brig Le Louis. Its mission was to challenge the Dutch closure of the river. If the Dutch allowed it through, Joseph would have broken the blockade in practice. If they stopped it, he could claim the Dutch had insulted the imperial flag. Either way, Joseph expected pressure to work in his favor. The imperial ships moved along the Scheldt. Near Fort Lillo, north of Antwerp, the Dutch were waiting, and the Dutch response was wonderfully understated. They did not send a mighty armada, they sent the Dolphin. One Dutch ship, a schooner from Zeeland. The imperial side had come with a political gamble. The Dutch answered with a cannon. The scene must have been almost theatrical. The Scheldt flowing quietly, the fort nearby, imperial colors visible, Dutch guns ready. The Le Louis kept moving. The Dolphin challenged it. The Austrians did not stop. So the Dutch fired one shot, not a full battle, not a cannonade, not a broadside that tore men apart and splintered the deck. One shot, and according to the famous story, that shot struck a soup kettle on the deck of Le Louis. Not the captain, not the mast, not the powder magazine, not the hull below the waterline. A soup kettle, the most unfortunate cooking vessel in European diplomatic history. And then came the even stranger part. Le Louis surrendered immediately. No glorious reply, no Austrian countershot, no duel on the river, no desperate attempt to break through. A cannonball hit a kettle, and the imperial challenge collapsed. The Kettle War had found its name. Now, to be fair, we should treat the story carefully. The basic naval incident is real. The imperial ship tried to pass. The Dutch intercepted it. Shots were fired. The ship was forced to strike its colors. That much appears in contemporary diplomatic reporting. The soup kettle detail is the famous tradition attached to the incident, the detail that turned a tense confrontation into a historical punchline. And it is exactly the kind of detail people remember. Nobody says, "Ah yes, the 1784 Scheldt navigation crisis." People say, "The war where they shot a soup kettle." That is how history survives in public memory. Not always through the most important detail, often through the strangest one. But Joseph II was not laughing. From his perspective, this was outraged. He had sent ships to assert imperial rights. The Dutch had fired on them. An imperial vessel had surrendered. The Scheldt remained closed, and Europe was now laughing at a Habsburg confrontation that had ended with broken kitchenware. Joseph declared war on the Dutch Republic later that month, but a real war did not quite arrive. The Dutch began preparing. Troops were mobilized. Fortifications were readied. The mood hardened. The Dutch feared an Austrian attack. The Austrians wanted compensation and concessions, and the whole affair had the potential to grow into something much bigger. Because this was late 18th century Europe, no crisis existed in isolation. France was watching. Prussia was watching. Britain was watching. Every river dispute could become an alliance problem. Every alliance problem could become a war scare. And every war scare could disturb the balance of Europe. So the Great Kettle War, ridiculous as it sounds, was also dangerous. It was funny only because it did not become worse. The deeper issue was Antwerp. The Dutch knew that if the Scheldt reopened, Antwerp could rise again. And Antwerp was not just another town. It had history. It had location. It had commercial memory. A free Antwerp meant competition. A blocked Antwerp meant Dutch advantage. For the people of the Austrian Netherlands, the closure was economic suffocation. Their river was chained, their port was muted, their trade was forced to obey foreign interests. For Joseph II, reopening the Scheldt was part of a larger reforming ambition. He wanted to make his territories more efficient, more productive, more rational. He looked at old treaties and medieval privileges and saw dead weight. He wanted movement. The Dutch wanted preservation. So the conflict was not modern versus backward in any simple sense. It was interest versus interest. Joseph wanted prosperity for his lands. The Dutch wanted to defend theirs. And between them lay the Scheldt, a river with too much memory and too much money. The crisis eventually moved from cannon smoke to negotiation. France stepped in as mediator. That was important. France had influence with the Dutch, but also reason to prevent a larger European war. Nobody wanted this ridiculous incident to become the spark for a continental conflict. The result was the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1785. The settlement was a compromise, but not the one Joseph wanted most. The Scheldt remained closed. The Dutch kept what mattered most to them. But they made concessions. They paid compensation. Some fortresses and territorial questions were adjusted. The crisis ended. Joseph got money and face-saving concessions. The Dutch kept the river shut. The soup kettle, presumably, did not recover. So who won the Kettle War? Technically, the Dutch. They stopped the ship. They kept the Scheldt closed. They defended the commercial system that protected their ports. But Joseph II did not leave empty-handed. The Dutch paid. The treaty gave Austria concessions. And the incident exposed something important. The Dutch Republic was no longer the confident maritime giant of the 1600s. It could still defend its interests, but it was politically divided, militarily anxious, diplomatically dependent. The Kettle War became part of the larger atmosphere of Dutch crisis in the 1780s. The Patriot movement, Orangist resistance, foreign influence, and the weakening of the old republic. A tiny confrontation on a river revealed a state under pressure. That is why the Kettle War matters. Not because of the kettle, because of what the kettle was sitting on top of. A collapsing balance of power, a fading commercial republic, a restless Habsburg emperor, a blocked river, a Europe where even one cannon shot could make diplomats panic. And then there is the absurdity. Because history is not always grand. Sometimes it is petty. Sometimes it is bureaucratic. Sometimes it is a ship sailing down a river to test a treaty. Sometimes it is a commander deciding whether to fire. Sometimes it is a cannonball hitting the least military object on deck. The Kettle War is funny because the violence was so limited. But it is memorable because the stakes were real. Had the Dutch miscalculated, Joseph might have pushed harder. Had France not mediated, the crisis might have grown. Had the Scheldt opened, Antwerp's commercial future might have changed earlier. Instead, Europe got a settlement. The Dutch kept their river closure. Austria got compensation. And the incident entered history as one of the strangest wars ever named. The irony is that Joseph II was not wrong about Antwerp. The Scheldt could not stay closed forever. Eventually, the old order would break. The French Revolutionary Wars would overturn the map of Europe. The Austrian Netherlands would fall to revolutionary France. The Scheldt would reopen. Antwerp would rise again. And long after Joseph II was gone, the river he wanted to free would become one of Europe's great commercial waterways again. But in 1784, Joseph tried too soon, with too little force, against a Dutch republic still willing to defend its old privileges. So the opening move of a grand imperial plan became a farce. One ship surrendered. One cannon fired. One kettle died. The Kettle War is one of those historical episodes that sounds like trivia, a joke, a pub fact, a war with no casualties except soup equipment. But beneath the joke is a hard truth. Trade routes matter, ports matter, rivers matter, and states will risk war to control them. The Scheldt was not just water, it was money, it was access. It was the difference between Antwerp's revival and Antwerp's stagnation. It was the commercial throat of the southern Netherlands. And the Dutch had their hand around it. Joseph II tried to pry that hand open. The Dutch fired back, and somehow the thing that took the hit was dinner. In the end, the Kettle War was not a great war. It was not even much of a battle, but it was perfect history. Small event, large meaning, ridiculous detail, serious cause, a disputed river, a fading republic, a frustrated emperor, a ship named Le Louis, a Dutch schooner named Dolphine, and a soup kettle that became more famous than many generals. The Kettle War reminds us that history does not always announce itself with drums and banners. Sometimes it arrives as one cannon shot across a river, and sometimes that shot misses glory completely and hits lunch